But you also had people that were very fine people on both sides.
And the aliens would mind meld and give them the technology. They're bad aliens.
So
are you surprised that Nazis were influenced by demons?
No, if demons are real, I would definitely think they'd be on the side of the Nazis.
Yeah.
McDonald's is connected to the Clintons. They chop up the bodies and put them into the sausage and hamburgers. People are being cannibalized. Look it up.
And I'm watching CNN talk about this as violent white nationalist protests. We have done everything in our power to keep this peaceful, you know?
It's Pepe's become kind of a symbol.
You're listening to Yeah Nah Pasaran, a show about fascism and its gravediggers. I'm Cam Smith.
I'm Andy Fleming.
And our guest this week is Van Badham, the author of Qanon and On, a short and shocking history of internet conspiracy cults. Thanks for joining us, Van.
Oh, thanks for having me. Love talking a bit of anti-fascism, one of my favourite things.
I guess, not to start off too Frost Nixon, but Van, there have been a few books about QAnon released recently. What makes yours different?
Well, mine's the Australian one, so there's that. And in the broader QAnon discourse, of which I'm very fortunate to be a part, I think the contribution that I can make with this book is giving a perspective about how what is very much an American cult has become an international problem. And the other thing that I did with my book, I have relied very heavily on the work of QAnon researchers like Marc-Andre Argentino, who's fantastic, and Mike Rothschild and Travis View and Will Summer, and all those guys are sort of the heavy hitters in the QAnon watching space. They really pay very close attention to the operations of the cult and the sort of day-to-day activities of the cult. But as I started writing about QAnon, my interest, because of the interests that I hold as a activist in Australian public life, became about a broader geopolitical question around campaigning and how QAnon is just the latest in a number of phenomena associated with the practice of bad faith mainstream political actors sort of weaponising a part of the electorate that hasn't been activated in a very long time. So that my contribution with the book is the book isn't just about QAnon. It looks at Gamergate and Pizzagate and QAnon and various other sort of offshoot theories, like a bit of the anti-vax stuff, to look at how the organised hard right have weaponised this community and used the internet to create a very effective propaganda and disinformation pipeline.
Good answer, but the answer I was actually looking for is this book has me in it.
Oh, well, that's the best thing about the book, is obviously I interviewed the best of the best. Like, I should point out, Cam Smith, the world we're living in is so weird that you were one of the experts who I spoke to. I spoke to clinical psychologists. I spoke to guys who track weird sort of evangelical Christian conspiracy theories online. But I also interviewed Miles Taylor, who's a former national security advisor in the Bush and Trump administrations. And I'm like, if you and Miles Taylor are both covered here, we really have a broad-based social problem we need to address. You know what I mean?
Yeah, something's gone a bit weird.
Something's gone a bit weird. It's like, here are my anarchist anti-fascist pals, and also someone from the Bush administration is not really where I ever saw myself going, but we are where we are.
How do you situate Gamergate in terms of this whole QAnon phenomenon?
Well, I think a lot of particularly feminist, like I was one of the feminists who got targeted in Gamergate in a very small and sort of local way. It was sort of, like the poor quality Australian diffusion brand of harassment that I was subjected to during the sort of peak of Gamergate. And, of course, Gamergate was when 4chan essentially decided that they would pursue a vendetta against feminists who had critiques of video games. It sort of started around, it really started around 2012 when they started harassing a feminist games academic called Anita Sarkeesian, and then peaked around 2014 and continued until around 2016 and morphed into quite the online political movement. And it was 4chan going essentially, we don't want girl germs in our gamer spaces, and let's just 4chan the hell out of these women who are kicking off about games. And it was just the most extraordinary, this extraordinary sort of activist upsurge of coordinated misogyny. And you had the sort of attacks on Zoe Quinn, who ended up living in an elevator shaft because half the internet was coming after them and threatening to kill them, and the most incredible harassment. People like Brianna Wu, who was driven from her home, like this kind of horrendous stuff. My localized experience of it was in 2016. They hacked my Twitter account and sent racially abusive messages to my friends and published sexually explicit material on the internet. And I was like calling people at The Guardian who were calling people at Twitter to try and get this thing sort of shut down. And this sort of constant sort of harassment and abuse and anxiety that went with that particular campaign. Well, it turned out that Steve Bannon was watching, and Steve Bannon was already quite aware of the power of the internet, in particular of this sort of class of, you know, gamer boys on the internet. He had been involved in trying to sell he'd been, when in one of his many incarnations, when he'd been a merchant banker, he was involved in some kind of business deal where they were trying to like float the currency of World of Warcraft. So you could, if you were playing World of Warcraft, you could earn certain credits and buy certain things, and like a currency exchange had popped up within the game, and Bannon's people were like, we can monetize this ourselves and take it over. And there was this sort of mass revolt of gamers against this sort of corporate takeover of World of Warcraft credit trading. And Bannon at the time described it as realizing the monster power of the internet. And of course, when Gamergate happened, like the willingness of this sort of 4chan community and communities around it to do literally anything. I mean, Zoe Quinn's father was in ICU, I think was having heart problems. The disease or illness is not the point. The point is he was in ICU, and Gamergaters sent this extremely ill man a packet of photographs of Zoe Quinn that they'd downloaded from the internet and masturbated upon. And these sort of despoiled images were sent to Zoe Quinn's father when he was in ICU. And it's like, that's extraordinary. Like as a political act, that is one of the most despicable things I've ever heard of. And of course, Bannon was watching all of this going, well, this is incredible. Like, people who are willing to do things like this are people who are willing to do anything, like join my project for a white ethno-state. So locating the sort of Gamergate as this place where people like Bannon realised what the internet could do, the kind of communities it could foster and what it was capable of, for me, that's the context. That's how you get Pizzagate. It's how you get identities like Alex Jones, and it's how you get QAnon.
Gamergate, as a misogynist exercise, developed an audience which Bannon then redeployed. But do you find that misogyny, that thread remains within QAnon?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I called the chapter about Gamergate in the book Gateway Drugs because we know this from studying patterns of terrorism in the West, that there is a misogyny is the gateway drug to acts of violence and greater terror. It's like, if you like misogyny, you will absolutely love racism. You know, like you really see that channel. Once you're in a forum that says it's okay to call women bitches or sluts or whores and talk about raping them, once you can dehumanize 51% of the population, it's not too hard to demonize the rest. And I can say quite definitively that pipeline exists because I've been getting lots of love letters this week from our friends in Melbourne and, in fact, all over the world, as I call them, the anti-something protesters, and I can do that in this forum quite explicitly, the neo-fascists who are having their little street parties, swastikas, nooses and all in the streets of Melbourne. They're aware of the fact that I've written this book. Obviously, I've been sharing a lot of material, critiquing, I believe is the polite word, their political behaviour and objectives. And I've just been absolutely deluged this week. I think I blocked about 500 people 2 days ago. And, I mean, the misogyny just drips. Jackie Lambie, who is an interesting political character, a person not necessarily the most ideologically consistent individual, our Jackie. She gave a really great speech in Parliament about a week ago where she was saying, you know, put your big pants on and get vaccinated, take a bit of adult responsibility. And the clip of her giving the speech in Parliament where she laid into Pauline Hanson went quite viral. And I shared it because I want to reach the people who have voted for Jackie Lambie and who think she's, you know, I want to reach them with a pro-vax anti-fascist message. I think that's quite a good community to get on board with the anti-fascist project. And the misogyny directed at Jackie Lambie was, I mean, it was old school. I haven't seen anything that bad in a few years because I'm now just like the blocking queen. I've been harassed so much. I said to somebody the other day who was like, are you all right? I see you're getting a lot of harassment. I was like, I've been at this rodeo so long that they've given me a free horse. Like, it's, you know, in our household, we call me getting a death threat a day ending in Y. And but the misogyny directed towards Jackie and myself this week, it was really like being back there in the trenches of the sort of Gamergate era and just the constant dripping hatred of women. And of course, there are women who join in on that as well. You know, the kind of person who the feminist community in Australia often refers to as the boy suck, or academic communities refer to as those who make patriarchal bargaining, like women who think that if they ingratiate themselves with misogynists, it will spare them from misogyny. Spoiler alert, this has never happened. They joined in on it too. But just so everybody's aware, you know, I'm a whore, I'm a slag, I'm a slut, I'm ugly, I'm fat. Nothing really changes.
A lot of this abuse is taking place on Twitter. Can you explain what the relationship is between racist, misogynist trolls on 4chan and how that sentiment is then harnessed and conveyed through Reddit, Twitter, Facebook and elsewhere? What are the steps that are involved?
Well, academics call it the web centipede, where messages are effectively tested in certain fora. So 4chan, for anyone listening to the show who's not familiar, 4chan is an image board. It began it's a format that sort of started in Japan, where website participants were able to make posts in real time and post pictures, which when this all started in late 1990s, early 2000s, when this sort of internet form started, was quite amazing. Oh my God, posting pictures, incredible. And the 4chan was built by a 15-year-old boy called Christopher Poole, who was known online as Moot, who just copied the code from one of these Japanese websites because he was an anime fan and really just wanted to talk about anime. And the way the site was structured meant everybody who posted was anonymous. So it became quite an interesting experiment for sociologists to look at how people behave when their anonymity is completely guaranteed in this sort of constantly refreshing real-time conversation where nobody knows who the various speakers are. And because it had originally been created by a 15-year-old boy, not that anyone knew this at the time, who was into sort of anime, it attracted the sort of young Western boys who had access to the internet and wanted to talk about like porn and like sexually explicit tentacle material and the rest of it. So it sort of kicked off this very anything goes. And because they were essentially adolescents or adults who were indulging a sort of adolescent mindset, it really became a place where it was one of the unspoken laws of 4chan is like whatever you saw that was shocking, there'll be something more shocking in the next post, and had this internal culture of sort of pushing the envelope as far as could possibly be. I mean, this has always existed on the internet. I'm so old. I remember things like rotten.com and, you know, how does like 2 girls, 1 cup and Goatsy and things like this. Like this has always been part of challenging the sort of free speech principles of the internet is, well, how far can we push that? But of course, what happened on 4chan, one of the articles I talk about in the book is an American writer for the Daily Beast who was like, the thing is that if you create a space where misogyny or racism can be ironic, is people who hold those values completely unironically will hitch their fascism to what you're doing. And of course, it became a place where essentially racism could be message tested. And you had people like Andrew Anglin from the Daily Stormer who just replicated 4chan and the cultural style of 4chan when he built the Daily Stormer. Like he's quite honest about that, you know, there was zing to it and there was this sort of cultural heft that came with the way people communicated on 4chan. And of course, various other actors have looked at what gets purchased on 4chan, like the QAnon story, like Hillary Clinton's going to be indicted and, you know, there's a deep state and military people and Donald Trump are trying to save us all from the pedophiles and the rest of it. Very early on, people saw the capacity to build communities through Reddit channels that weren't like 4chan, that weren't saturated with sort of adolescent young heterosexual men from the West, but to sort of stoke and create formats with a tested message that could appeal to different demographics. And of course, once you get to Facebook, where everybody's mum is, and particularly on Facebook, where you have a large community of people who are older, who don't have particularly sophisticated information literacy, the older you are, the more likely you are to trust what you read on Facebook, which is a shame. You end up with bad faith actors sort of stoking particular communities and particular demographics around cultural images and communities that radicalize them in a far right direction. And I certainly go into detail in the book about how that was achieved and who got involved when and how the QAnon myth and Pizzagate and Gamergate metastasized. In terms of Twitter, one of the things they really pioneered with Gamergate was the concept of Twitter swarming. where if you could be bothered creating a number of sock puppet accounts, if you could be bothered creating 20, 40, 60, 100 accounts, you could push, or you could automate messages and attack messages out really quickly with hashtags and cause hashtags to trend, all of which targeted like a victim or a movement or a particular set of accounts. And you only needed like a small group of people who knew what they were doing to do this. And then the swarm was like this proximity effect where if a hashtag started trending that was like, well, for example, kill all feminists or whatever, you could rely on communities who were simpatico to those beliefs to jump on board and to create organic growth. And it's these kind of lessons learned organically that have been totally professionalized and organized by digital actors to run campaigns like the Trump campaign and the Clive Palmer campaign in 2019 in Australia, and certainly in Brexit. Like these kind of phenomena have been studied and used and deployed really to the detriment of democracy everywhere.
In the States, I think we've discussed on the show before about how, the last 20 years of Fox News sort of primed an older generation to be quite ready to be pilled on things like QAnon. When you look at Australia, what sort of demographics were the first to latch onto QAnon, and what do you think primed them?
Well, in Australia, and I talk about this in the book as well, like it got in through the wellness community. So in America, QAnon was just ripe for a disappointed alt-right who'd campaigned to get Trump elected. Trump had got elected, and the white ethno-state didn't materialise, and pesky democracy and various processes, the vast inefficiency of the failed American state frustrated the Trump agenda. Yay, I think. And of course, in America, you have these political communities that are already radicalised around things like Fox News, but in Australia and in Germany, the way that the sort of QAnon mythos entered was through the wellness community. In fact, I spoke to this amazing guy when I was writing the book called Cam Smith, who's like an extremism and anti-fascist researcher from Melbourne, who talked about how he was seeing sort of yummy mummy wellness groups start going, yeah, I'm really concerned about Hillary Clinton, and organising get-togethers in pubs in Oakley to talk about their particular sudden political antipathies to the American deep state. And that was facilitated by Facebook and sort of algorithmic radicalisation, which is a term that Joshua Roos, he writes for The Conversation, he's a counterterrorism expert, and I did a show with him the other day, and he's really good. And that's his phrase, is algorithmic radicalisation, which he originally looked at in like jihadist communities. And Facebook essentially did the same thing in Australia. Like a friend of mine was looking for organic dog food to feed her dog, and ended up getting recommended all of these anti-vax pages, this sort of soft anti-vax message that pretty quickly became recommendations to watch propaganda videos from the United States about the secret conspiracy of pedophiles working with Hillary Clinton to torture children for their screams, to develop superpowers from the extracted blood of tortured children kind of thing. And that's really how it got in Australia. In Germany, it's a big and ugly problem, obviously, because there are that community, that tradition of extremism in Germany has never entirely gone away. And you've seen some pretty serious protest action in Germany of this weird sort of meld of wellness and radical far-right belief. Bridget Delaney, who's my colleague at The Guardian, who writes about like wellness and has a really great book called Wellmania about her sort of experiences in the wellness community, she started picking up on the sort of wellness crossover with QAnon a couple of years ago, and she identified a phenomenon that another writer had called fusion paranoia, where it's like, hey, like I really like organic food and eating paleo, and I'm a bit dodgy on vaccines because I don't trust Big Pharma. That community meets a bunch of fascists going, yeah, well, Big Pharma is one of the institutions that we want to strap to our project to build a white ethno-state, and we can do that by convincing people not to take drugs that will save their lives, because then we can convince them to do anything. It's like, oh my God, me too. That kind of fusion of paranoid beliefs creates this alliance where they start feeding different forms of propaganda to one another. And certainly in the groups, and I'm sure you guys have seen this as well, that I'm sort of hiding into research, that I hid into research the book and sort of my continuing interest in this space, like this bizarre sort of, Nazis for organic bread kind of movement that's really taken off. And, like I love fresh oranges, vitamin C and genocide. kind of themes that keep cropping up is I mean, it's genuinely terrifying. It was interesting. So in the book, another one of the researchers I spoke to were the guys from the QAnon Origins Project in the United States, who do a lot of writing for Bellingcat and monitor these guys all the time. I think you've had them on the show before, and they're really, really good. And one of them did the expert read of the manuscript when it was still in draft form, and he was like, wow, lizard people are such a big thing in Australia. He's like, lizard people aren't a big thing in American QAnon. Like, they've got their own sort of culturally specific paranoias. And I was like, oh, no, like QAnon in Australia, we get a lot of lizard people. So they're these sort of interesting cultural flavors that come with the different groupings in the different sort of places where the conspiracy theory has latched on.
I guess the other great thing about Australian QAnon that I think surpassed, the original flavor is that what was the best that the Americans got out of Trump was, those guys don't like pedophiles, me neither. Whereas we had a QAnon guy be best mates with the Prime Minister.
Yeah, and whose son is still very active on Gab and threatens to hang Malcolm Turnbull in public, which I find very interesting. Yeah, so the Americans, like when I spoke to Miles Taylor, he was just like, I've got to say, as a national security person, that's a concern. I was like, yeah, it is. It's kind of a concern that the Prime Minister's best friend is a QAnon and his son is a QAnon, and the Prime Minister's best friend's wife has, of course, posted QAnon slogans and material in her various social media expressions, and they have stayed at Kirribilli House. The wife was given a security clearance, and it's like, that may not seem like a big security risk now if they're friends with the Prime Minister, but he's not going to be Prime Minister forever. Hopefully he won't be Prime Minister by the end of next year. And the idea that another government could come in, even another Liberal leader, I mean, that sort of QAnon circle around Scott Morrison was very public about attacking Scott Morrison's rivals and enemies within the Liberal Party, which is something I found very interesting, was that, there had been public denunciations of Alexander Downer, public denunciations of Malcolm Turnbull and of Julie Bishop. One of the quotes I included in the book was Lucy Turnbull on Twitter talked about how she and Malcolm were like in the street and somebody drove up to them and screamed, "Hey, pedophiles," and then sort of drove off. Like, really shows the penetration of the QAnon mythology and how it's been seeded. The idea that a Prime Minister of Australia would welcome that in to Kirribilli House is, I mean, completely extraordinary. There are lots of reasons that Scott Morrison should lose the next election, and that lack of judgment or simpatico-ness with those beliefs, that's the thing. It's either extremely bad judgment, the world's ugliest form of cynicism, or some kind of like shared set of values. And in all three of those cases, that's pretty disqualifying from a leadership role. One of the situations you look at in relation to that is the whole thing around Scott Morrison calling out ritual abuse in his apology to victims of institutional child abuse. I was curious, where did you land on how that came to be? Do you think that was partly Tim Stewart getting in his ear, or do you think that perhaps his own evangelical beliefs might have played a role in that? Look, it could be his evangelical beliefs. And certainly the thing about QAnon and that whole sort of conspiracy genre is that it's grounded in the apocalyptic language of evangelical Christianity, like absolutely. And it uses like these concepts of like the Great Awakening, the very specific sort of Protestant concepts as well, and these various bits of Christian iconography that have been absorbed into this mythos. But the specific use of the term ritual sexual abuse is really interesting because, one, it harks back to the satanic panic of the 1980s in America, this idea that evil Satan-worshipping pedophiles were everywhere and they were getting their hands on your children. And this was like a big media storm back in the 1980s that resulted in like 12,000 complaints to the police, none of which had a single shred of evidence to argue any of them, and were all dismissed, kind of thing. But the ritual sexual abuse is, obviously this idea that it's all Satan worshippers who are stealing children and torturing them for their screams and doing abominable things to them. And of course, the term is discredited in the child protection space because it's the kind of thing used by cranks. And, this idea that that child abusers are dressing up like the great Satan to harm children and whatever is very, like, it is discredited after things like the Satanic Panic. We know that people who abuse children are generally people who are close to them, not secret cults snatching kids. They're it's opportunistic abuse that comes from people betraying intimate trust through a grooming process. We know all of this now. And when that term popped up in Morrison's speech, it was when Morrison was supposedly giving the apology to the victims of sexual violence and abuse after the Royal Commission into institutional cover-ups of abuse. And you had people who had been through the most extraordinary, just absolutely horrendous family situations, people who had buried kids who had committed suicide after abuse, very sensitive moment for the nation. And then in the apology that's supposed to account for, the government's role in allowing these kind of abuses to perpetuate by not applying the scrutiny deserved to these various institutions, you have this sort of dog whistle to really nutty paranoid stuff that gets said by the Prime Minister. And of course it got picked up by the kind of people who research and investigate in this space who was hang on. And there's a paper trail or a digital paper trail from Tim Stewart, who had been hanging out with a internet crank called Ella High Priest. And Ella High Priest and Tim Stewart had been talking about different ways they could influence the Prime Minister to get him to talk about all kinds of things. And Tim Stewart had this relationship with a well-known sort of conspiracy theorist in the United States called Isaac Cappy, who was one of these guys claiming that everybody in Hollywood was a pedophile, and that was probably the reason his career as an actor didn't go anywhere. That was his argument. He had been out to Australia and hung out with the Stewarts, and they'd been hanging out with Fiona Barnett, who's just Australia's queen conspiracy theorist around this stuff. Fiona Barnett does these amazing videos, and in the footnotes of the book, I link to some of them. They are really very special, where she tells these incredible lurid tales about how she was sexually abused by various people, including 3 Labor prime ministers and Richard Nixon, at the behest of the CIA because of her grandparents, who were Nazi spies brought out to Australia secretly by the CIA to run an MK Ultra program and turned her into a child assassin. And it's this level of influence that the Prime Minister was subject to, dropping terms like ritual sexual abuse into speeches in Parliament at the behest of Tim Stewart and this sort of extraordinary rogues gallery of just bonkers conspiracy theorists who Tim Stewart had fallen in with. And these were the people influencing the language of a prime ministerial speech. And it's when you see that speech in the context of Fiona Barnett's videos that you just think this is more than a security risk. This is a reality risk. A prime minister who's willing to engage with these people is off-piste. And it's really a cause for concern. When I found the Fiona Barnett videos, a lot of the research I did for the book was really disturbing, as you can imagine. Some very desperate and vulnerable people, but also some really evil people. Writing a book about Steve Bannon is not easy. It's not a happy, joy, fun time. But the Fiona Barnett stuff is so unhinged, and the willingness of people to sort of engage with that level of fantasy and paranoia and form groups around it and activate around that was really confronting for me. That was really terrifying. That was there are people who will believe anything if their buttons are pressed in a certain way.
In terms of the response of Morrison to the commission, but also much more recently, we've seen thousands of people take to the streets to decry Dictator Dan, to protest against vaccinations. And they've done so in quite large numbers. And I wonder what you think about the government's response, because it seems to be it seems to me to be the case that many of those who are taken to the streets would possibly be expected to vote not for Labor, but for the coalition. Therefore, it makes sense for the Prime Minister and others not to be too harsh in their criticism of these mobilisations. What's your reading on the situation, and how do you think QAnon has influenced it?
Well, we know those people. You know those people. I know them from the groups that I lurk in. We can identify them. Like my friend Bunnings Karen, and Cam, I know that there's some dispute around the original Bunnings Karen.
Well, there's no dispute. There's just a few people need to get their timelines correct.
The woman who I know as Bunnings Karen, certainly from the moment she popped out outside the CFMEU, you can imagine I've had quite a bit to do with the CFMEU in my time, and she is not a member. So, I mean, it was really confronting for me to sit there and because I'm watching all of those protests play out in the groups that I'm in, that I've infiltrated, and see that this is an organised far right doing what an organised far right do, which is seize an opportunity to mobilise and exaggerate their numbers at a time where there's not going to be opposition on the streets because everybody else, quite sensibly, was at home sheltering from the invisible killer virus ripping through the community. And the attitude of the Liberal Party and the National Party towards these people it actually did stagger me. Like, when you read about the formation of the Liberals back in 48 and the sort of vision that Menzies had for the party, Menzies was very much of the belief, the reason why the Liberals are called the Liberals and not the Conservatives was because they did have liberal values. They're not values that I share, but they had liberal values. And his opinion always was that they didn't have to play to placate the Conservatives because the Conservatives would vote for them anyway, that as an anti-communist sort of anti-Labor party that vote would be sewn up. And that was always the sort of compact with the Liberal Party, that, you know, the Conservatives could rant and rave, but they would have to sort of come along with the centre-right project anyway. Wow, what an optimistic post-World War II sort of attitude that has totally evaporated over time. The idea that 1 in 5 members of the Coalition Caucus in Victorian State Parliament went down to hang out with the demonstrators. Peter Credlin was there. Obviously Craig Kelly, who was elected as a federal Liberal, even though he's supposedly independent now, or UAP or whatever he is. George Christensen giving them their solidarity. Like, it is absolutely extraordinary how far the Liberal Party has fallen from liberal values. And I made this point online that when you have a party whose own members are white-anting and attacking sort of liberal figures like Julia Banks and Alexander Downer and Julie Bishop and Malcolm Turnbull, like, those are the people who you want to represent the brand because they're the ones who swing voters would more identify with. Whereas the Liberal brand is becoming associated with these lunatics on the streets of Melbourne who are marching nooses past Parliament House. And we all know that the nooses are the least of it. There have been people turning up with weapons to these events. There have been people now arrested for inciting the bringing of guns and the making of bombs, death threats against the Premier of Victoria constantly. Like, they are a hard, organised radical right. And there seems to be this sort of cynical opportunism of the Liberals and the Nationals thinking that they can somehow, that these people can sort of serve their interests and they can be sort of weaponised as a radical sort of front for their political movement and ideology, that this is how you lay one on Daniel Andrews. It is the most extraordinarily stupid political thing I've heard in Australia in some time, given the fact that Andrews, every day those protesters are out, Andrews' poll numbers go up. Like, he's now, there was a poll that came out the other day that had him at 58-42, and there were pollsters online disagreeing, saying that was conservative, and they had him more at 60-61 to 39, which is like, John Curtin didn't get 61 at the height of the Second World War when he just built the welfare state. Like, Curtin was on 58-42. So it's just an extraordinarily scary political calculation because, you know, this is absolutely recognisably a far-right uprising. You know, you don't take swastikas to a centrist gathering. That doesn't tend to get the crowds in. The cultural memory has not dimmed so much about what that actually represents. And, of course, the language is so hostile. The threats are violent. Like, the character of those protests is really anti-democratic. Like, call me old school, but I don't think threatening to hang the Premier is really the kind of movement that celebrates democracy. And yet this willingness of the Liberals to engage it, my theory is that they've consumed so much of their own online propaganda that they are thinking that this is the dominant character of the Australian right. And I just think that this is a massive miscalculation. I mean, one of the points that my partner Ben and I do a weekly podcast called The Week on Wednesday, where we sort of tease out the political issues of the week. And Ben was like, his analysis is that the Liberals are following the Republican playbook in the United States so closely that they think that the sort of tactics of an emboldened hard right who are tub thumping and making threats and waving nooses. I mean, you have this going on all over America at the moment, and it is genuinely terrifying. The thing is, in America, that the sort of street theatre of intimidation has an electoral meaning, because if you get a bunch of heavily armed white people out on the streets waving nooses and threatening to kill or kidnap, say, the governor of Michigan, it's a very effective deterrent from people from minority communities and marginalised groups from getting to the polls, because are you so committed to voting for somebody who, might or possibly disappoint you in office that you're willing to run a gamut of like hard right, heavily armed, gun wielding neo-fascists in order to get to the ballot box? But in Australia, we have compulsory voting. So the politics of intimidation don't really work here. And the idea that political calculations are being made to brand associate with that kind of movement, I don't think is a particularly intelligent or sophisticated one. And I think they're already paying a price for that. Whether there's an argument that this is them trying to sort of lock down their base, well, I think they're looking at the wrong base. I think the Liberals are infinitely more dangerous when they play to that sort of middle Australia, socially liberal, economically conservative kind of community that genuinely and generally plays much better for them. And I can't get my head around this political logic unless they think they can run the kind of voter suppression campaigns that have been run in the United States. And certainly things like their voter ID laws tend to indicate that that's probably where their thinking is at.
So we won't be seeing the anti-fascist riot in Australia as they did in Washington on January the 6th?
Well, that's one of my favourite stories in the book, is how quickly, when the coup failed on January 6, the right mobilised incredibly quickly to try and blame anti-fascists for January 6, which I've got to say, I've always been very proud to be an anti-fascist and to join my anti-fascist comrades in the streets. I've never really engaged that level of organisation to get literally thousands of people willing to dress up like fascists, go to a pro-Trump demo, sing all the songs, wave all the flags, stay in hotels, and then take over a parliament building in disguise. I'm used to just rocking up. That's a lot of effort to go to. But this extraordinary story that the New York Times broke the story of the origins of the sort of disinformation pipeline that tried to ping anti-fascists for January 6. The book tells the whole story. And in fact, so it was a radio, some guy online was like, oh, it's definitely Antifa. And then the guy who was subbing in for Rush Limbaugh, he announced this sort of tweet as if it was the fact. And then they brought in that they had facial recognition technology that had pinged the January 6 protesters as Antifa and Extinction Rebellion. And this was all pushed out through Epoch Times and the Mooney Church. And it was this incredible disinformation pipeline that sort of pushed this nonsense, like this easily disprovable nonsense. And of course, our friends George Christensen and Craig Kelly in Australia got up and said, oh yeah, no, we've seen the footage and we know about this story and it's definitely, Antifa. And Kelly and Christensen making these comments was then used by Fox News to push this line. They were like, oh, well, Australian parliamentarians, they know they've got this intelligence that says that this is what's going on. And then the Fox News line got repeated by Matt Gaetz, who's a Trumpian congressman from Florida, during the session where they were trying to accredit the votes. Like this amazing, just total, abject lie went around the world incredibly quickly. And you had Australian political actors, Christensen and Kelly, who were part of that. It's the rabbit hole of this stuff. I can't stress enough that it's not just a few kooks being kooky. There are very powerful political interests on the right who are weaponizing these communities to serve their own agendas. And a lot of people are participating in that. It is disgustingly cynical. And in Australia, where the 2019 election really was determined by digital campaigning, there were operatives from the Labor Party who described what Clive Palmer was doing online as being in a war and not realising you had a second front until all your cities had burned down. and the kind of disinformation campaigning that has been used in Australian federal politics for the past couple of years is a real source of concern, especially when you look at just how entrenched those pipelines of disinformation have become in the United States. Like, there are people who will tell you, like, totally believing on the basis of media that they've consumed, that anti-fascists were responsible for January 6th, and it was all a false flag operation and a trap and the rest of it. It is amazing.
Well, I think that it points to one of the themes in the book, which is that one of the reasons QAnon and similar theories have such power is because they don't depend upon a factual account of the world. Instead, they present a certain narrative which is appealing to at least a segment of the population. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about what you think that vision is, and where does this desperate, let's say, desire for some such narrative, some consoling narrative, where does it come from? In other words, do you think are the underlying social factors that render people vulnerable to this kind of nonsense?
Well, certainly my own experience of the book, like I went into the book as a left-wing person going, well, surely, and, and me as a veteran of 1,000 arguments online, like 1,000,000 arguments online, 1,000 is pretty conservative. I think I have 1,000 arguments with people online in a day. And I think left-wing people really struggle to understand that right-wing people just don't think the way we do. And writing the book, I had to really take the beam out of my own eye from two misconceptions I had. One, that if you just argue the truth with people, of course, they'll come around to it. Like, this is the height of left-wing vanity, is to presume that facts and logic will win an argument. Like, God bless us, guys. Like, that's just adorable to think that you can argue the facts or the science and that will be enough to change someone's mind. Similarly, arguing the morality of a situation is completely ridiculous when you're arguing the morality of a situation with people who fundamentally believe in the creation of a white ethno-state. You are not going to win on an argument, on a moral argument with those people, because they have no morals. So that was a big thing for me, was the research, and especially when I spoke to clinical psychologists who were like, people are attracted to conspiracy theories when they're overwhelmed with information and they experience a distress or a status upset in particular, and the world becomes too complicated for them. And conspiracy theories are great because conspiracy theories give you both a very polarized and simple understanding of the world around you, that it's either good, bad, light, dark, patriots or traitors, human beings or lizard people. Everything becomes a binary. And that's a huge comfort for people who are overwhelmed by all the nuance of different information. And obviously you can see the appeal of conspiratorial thinking during coronavirus, where overnight suddenly everybody had to learn, a language of biological sciences and virology, and what were the correct policy responses in a situation where the science was changing. These are really difficult times that require enormous amounts of intellectual effort and judgment, constantly reevaluated judgment, and that is too much for some people if they've got other things going on in their lives. So that was one of the things that I had to be disabused of. The other thing that was really important, like I'm a very, boring Marxist, and everything is material. And I came at it from going, right, well, we know that this is about globalization and its discontents. This is about an oppressed class, specifically in the United States, a displaced working class and people who have been shafted by the offshoring of manufacturing and the neoliberal erosion of the American dream and working class purchase on standard of living. That's where I came at it from. And that's not who these people are at all. Like, working class people don't have time to fly down or money to fly down to Washington and stay in a 4-star hotel and, go to a few restaurants before trying to overthrow the government on the weekend. Like, that's not the working class experience in the United States at all. Not in a country where 1 in 7 households live in food poverty. Like, that's not who those people are. And the research that kept coming out, and I'd like to say I'm not the only person who made that misjudgment. Like, the big left liberal publications in the United States were certainly running with this image of the Trump voter, and Trump is this sort of blue collar billionaire icon, which was something that he was described as by Sean Hannity and Fox. And, this idea that I think a lot of people had, particularly outside the United States, that Trump voters were, the Rust Belt working class, and he won Pennsylvania and Michigan and Wisconsin on the basis of this sort of working class vote. That's not that's not the Trump base. The Trump base is a disaffected middle class, and they're not disaffected by globalization. They're disaffected because they've been culturally displaced by social, liberal social movements that have looked at things like trying to take apart the structure of American racism and structural racism in America. They're a group that sees their cultural image of themselves threatened by feminism and marriage equality and, movements for trans inclusion. There's a really great American academic called Thomas Macaulay who nailed the sort of terminology of a culturalist right in America, of a right who are sort of post-material and more concerned about status and remaining at the center of status in America than anything else. And this sort of, privileged position of being able to claim the identity of being American is really what they're about. This vanity project, and really the Trumpian project was one of vanity and assigning to a narrow demographic of privileged people the ownership of what it meant to be American or successful or anything like that. And there's an American conservative intellectual called Tom Nichols who writes for The Atlantic, who I think is really great. He's one of those never Trump conservatives who's seen just like the collapse of the conservative project in America and has the honesty to analyse where it all went so terribly wrong. And he used a term which has been out of the parlance for some time, as you can imagine, to describe these people, which is the lumpen bourgeoisie. That you're not looking at a group of people who are trying to overthrow the government because they're unrepresented by it. They're trying to overthrow the government to ensure they'll always be represented by it, and that their anxiety around a status under pressure from other communities in the United States is that anxiety can be relieved. And these are the people who are seeing join these movements. They're small business owners, they're middle-class professionals. They're people who have the time in Australia to sit on the steps of Parliament House in Victoria for a couple of weeks. They're people who have the anxiety around, how dare you tell me what to do? They're not oppressed or marginalised. People who are oppressed and marginalised communities are very aware of the fact that they're told what to do all the time. And that's quite a common experience and something that you rationalise when you're in a situation of powerlessness. So it was really interesting writing the book to sort of to get on that channel of looking at a lumpen bourgeoisie, a post-material community who are so obsessed with their own privilege that they're literally willing to overthrow governments and destroy institutions to maintain it.
Van, I know at some point in the book you make reference to a situation where post the Second World War there was a kind of formal or informal blockade on the promotion of fascist political activity in cultural institutions. But now internet culture has overcome that obstacle. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that, about the liberation of hate, let's say, online, and also whether or not you think or what kinds of remedies are available to others who want to denounce fascism and so on, in terms of their online activities. Like, is this just a situation which always obtains where you have the free, anonymous exchange of ideas, or is this instead symptomatic of a broader cultural phenomenon which allows for and promotes these kinds of ideas?
Oh, look, it's so thorny. I've always described myself as part of a libertarian Marxist tendency in my various incarnations as an anarcho-syndicalist or a democratic socialist, depending on what my mood is on any particular day. I've always sort of seen that the libertarianism of free speech politics is really central to a progressive ideological identity. And I've got to say, my adventures on the internet over the past few years have had they've really dented my idealism, I think is the politest way of putting that, because there are really important questions about the free speech absolutism of the internet and what that tangibly means for marginalised people. Like the project of the left is justice and kindness. They are the two values that we bed down on whatever left-wing tendency we identify within. And whether we're making justice and kindness impossible by defending a free speech internet, that's a really important question. And I think we have to recognise that the internet is horrendous. It has allowed this to come back. And like I said, the idea that if you allow an environment in which ironic racism, for example, or ironic homophobia or any other kind of ironic hatred is accepted currency, Like, what is to stop people who hold those values non-ironically from joining it? Like, there is nothing to stop them. And does that mean that there is a normalization of that language and that rhetoric? Yes. Does that have consequences in terms of reifying movements that will mobilize in the service of those objectives? Well, yes, we're seeing that in Melbourne. Like, we're absolutely seeing that. You know, they broke out the swastika on the weekend. Like, they were still denying it and, you know, playing cute about participation of the organised far right in those demonstrations. But there it was. And that's not going to go away. Like, what does it mean in terms of what does it mean within a democracy to look at such an absolutely strident anti-democratic movement? And that's what it is. You don't threaten to kill the premier if you're pro-democracy. Like, it's been a stoked and nurtured authoritarianism within that community, and they're immune because they live in a sealed information environment. And this is what the book talks about as well, that the further you go down the rabbit hole, the harder it is to come out, because you lose the people around you who try and argue facts and logic with you and you don't respond to them. They tend to disappear out of frustration. And then suddenly you start with a psychological distress, and then you end up in a sociological problem where, you know, your paranoias and your conspiratorial thinking are actively fueled by a combination of people who are like you and other people who are set to manipulate you in the service of an authoritarian project. Like, Bannon is quite explicit about where he wants this to lead. He's one of the most ideologically explicit political actors in the world. You know, like, and he has and in the book I go into detail about how organised his political project is to create an authoritarian movement that will destroy American democracy. Like, that's what he's doing. Like, he's not pretending to do anything else. And, you know, all of the political actors who are acting within that movement, like, that's the end goal as well. And, like, what does it mean in terms of how do we preserve democracy against people who are absolutely intent on its destruction and using what we would suggest was a forum for the, you know, expression of the purest flower of the democratic sentiment, which is, you know, like free speech absolutism. What does it mean to defend that? Well, currently we're defending a number of pipelines that are radicalizing people back into fascism and Nazism. And, like, there are arguments around what is, like, are the platforms responsible? Well, the platforms are partially responsible, certainly. I mean, I have 4,000 friends on Facebook who are QAnon supporters, even though Zuckerberg announced that all the QAnon accounts would be purged. They're still there. They're still communicating in memes. Like, I've joined those groups very easily in my project to research them. Like, what does it mean that the organisation of these protests in Melbourne and everywhere else are being done through Telegram? Like, anyone can join those groups. It's not difficult to do that. Like, Telegram isn't accountable to anyone. It's, you know, how do we possibly reel that in? Nina Yankovic, who's the disinformation scholar from the Wilson Centre, who I also interviewed from the book, who I think you guys have spoken to her as well. She's like, the bigger issue here is a cultural project that really is strident in institutional anti-fascism, that the idea that anti-fascism isn't something that we associate with the left, it's something that we associate with a majority position, because that was, you know, that was the legacy of the Second World War, was that this was to never happen again. And all sides agreed on that. But that consensus is broken down. The idea that a centre-right party, and this is one of the really surprising discoveries for me as well, was that to keep the fascists out, you need a moral and strong centre-right. You do actually need an explicit bulwark against authoritarianism to exist in the mainstream right. And the reason why this is becoming so frightening as a political trend, this sort of footsie with the far right from who are supposed to be mainstream centre-right actors, like, we've been here before as the West, and when we were here last time, it ended incredibly badly. And there has to be a kind of there has to be an institutional energy to fight fascism everywhere, like everywhere. Fight fascism always, everywhere. like from the universities to the health system to the media to like policing, it's got to be an absolute inherent value in every social institution we have, even if it is, and it's got to be a value encouraged in our ideological opposites as a bulwark against the alternative, who are currently marching down the streets of Melbourne with nooses, waving swastikas, threatening to kill people. Like, I don't think we can afford to be pure. I think we have to be active and alert.
Well, I think that's a good spot to leave it. I had a question, but my question got answered.
Which was what?
I was going to be, what do we do?
We smash them. We just got to smash them at all times. Like, I get up in the morning and I think, what can I do to fight fascism today? Like, what can I do? What can you do? What can any of us do to fight fascism today? And for everybody, there's going to be a different answer to that question, which is good, because we've got to fight them on all fronts.
My answer is usually the same, actually.
Because something is going very, very, very wrong if there are fascists at all. To be a fascist should be the most absolutely, like, shame, like the most hideously crippling private shame to have any fascist beliefs. The idea that you would express them in public, like there has to be complete social sanction for holding any of those values at all. Yeah, I mean, I find it terrifying. Writing the book, can I just say, I had weeks of nightmares because I went from this sort of, you know, like I have a very reliable Marxist analysis that applies to this situation, but it is actually wrong. The framework of approaching this is wrong. The source of the problem, like capitalism is the problem, but it's a class of capitalists who are dancing with the far right. And centrist right politicians are facilitating them. And despite every historical lesson that should inform them that they will come, the fascists will come for them too. They will eat out their parties, which is what's happening in the United States. Like, neo-fascism has overtaken the Republican Party. And people who thought that they could, where have I heard this before, control this tendency, like, it's now out of control and they are paying the political price for it.
Well, then, on that note, we'll wrap it up. If people want to find the book, it is available in all good bookstores. Qanon and On, a short and shocking history of internet conspiracy cults. Thanks for joining us. Well, Andy, that is all we've got time for. Global Intifada is up next. We'll catch you next week.
See you then.
Tune in to Grounding Disability Justice, 3CR's International Day of People with Disability broadcast. On 3rd of December, 7am to 7pm, we're making space to explore what disability justice has been and will be on these lands, with programming led by Black and Indigenous community members, in addition to programs by disabled broadcasters from the 3CR community. Visit 3cr.org.au/Disability Day 2021.
Coming up at the Nightcat, Better Late, running till 3am every Friday and Saturday, featuring the best local and international bands and DJs, including Zeitgeist Freedom Energy Exchange, Gypsy Brown with Tando, Spasta with Adriana and Odd Mob, Domingo Latino Sundays with La Influencia and Calle Luna. Upcoming shows including Art vs. Science, ModCon, I Know Leopard, and more. For info and tickets, head to thenightcat.com.au.
A 3CR supporter.